Hello everybody and welcome to our missed session. This was the session that I was attempting to do last week when my headset broke down on me. Well, I finally have a new headset, and so we're going to first cover chapter 20, and then I will do a following session where I'll cover chapters 21 and 22. So there will actually be two sessions for this particular week as I make up the session that was missed last week. So, Chapter 20, Population, Communities, and Urbanization. Some of the things we're going to be taking a look at in this chapter. What is demography as a field of inquiry? This is the study of population. We'll take a look at world population patterns, fertility patterns in the United States, population and migration, including immigration and emigration. We'll look at how communities have changed, the process of urbanization, various types of communities that exist, and finally looking at rural areas, and then we'll finish up with social policy and communities, taking a look at homelessness on a global scale. Some of the questions we're going to be addressing: how does rapid population growth contribute to the movement of large groups of people? Why have large cities grown at the expense of small villages in many parts of the world? And why are many residents of large and prosperous communities homeless? So, an interesting recent phenomenon is what's referred to as an aerotropolis. These are urban communities that begin springing up around airports. There will be business centers, there will be some housing, maybe a lot of hotels. You'll have shopping and things like that. But it's instead of springing up around where a city normally would have formed, now these are beginning to spring up around airports. In the past, historically, cities would often be near seaports or on waterways, or close to highways, railroad tracks, things like that, as these were the ways that people were moving. Recently, as airports, and I say recently, I mean really kind of within the last 100 years, as airports have become more and more common for commuter travel, not just for holiday travel, but within recently we have a lot of Airbuses, and commuter travel has become a way of life for some people. So you are now seeing communities spring up around airports. And of course, the definition of a community, it's just kind of a unit of social organization that gives people a sense of belonging. Communities can vary in size, in nature, the nature of the relationships within the communities. But community is a more general term that just kind of indicates spatial or political unit of social organization. If we think about, living in Northwest Indiana, really, as far as like where we kind of tend to align, you could make an argument that it's more aligned to Chicago than it is to Indianapolis and the rest of Indiana. And that would be more of a spatial alignment, which is why you see Democrats maybe more successful in this part of the state than in other parts of the states, because Illinois tends to be more of a blue state while Indiana tends to be more of a red state. But Northwest Indiana, Gary, Hammond especially, tend to align more with Chicago. Okay, I mentioned demography. It's the study of population, and it engages both natural and social scientists. There's biology involved with it, and a lot of census facts and things like that. But demography is essentially how we kind of look at a population as a whole and then break down component parts of a population into various group affiliations. Biological aspect of demography would be fertility, which is incidence of birth within a particular society. It's the level of reproduction. Demography is essentially the scientific study of population. Now, Robert Thomas Malthus originated the idea that if there aren't checks made to the population growth of human beings, eventually we would outstrip the planet's ability to support us, and we would drain all the natural resources. So oftentimes when you hear the idea of population control discussed, you might hear someone talk about advocating Malthusian population checks, because Thomas Malthus advocated population control. Marx kind of responded to this. He saw no special relationship between population and the supply of resources. He essentially kind of looked at overpopulation when it was happening and linked that to the unequal distribution of resources. Malthus's views are still around. People still use them, and a neo or new Malthusian view stresses birth control and sensible use of resources. In a certain sense, what China attempted to implement in the 80s and 90s, and still has with regards to legal childbirth, that would be a neo-Malthusian population control method. Okay, I mentioned the census. It's essentially when any particular entity counts all the people that are within a particular population. So it's the enumeration or counting of a population. A lot of the vital statistics that the census records, births, deaths, marriages, divorces, are gathered through a registration system maintained by the government. The government sends out census forms. The government's just wanting to know how many people are living in the country. Social scientists use this data sometimes because it's actually all public record. You can run regressions through the U.S. Census site examining correlations between demographic factors. But the government does use census and does conduct it periodically. Okay, so the elements of demography. We mentioned fertility, which is the incidence of childbirth. A lot of times that number becomes unwieldy to use, so it's converted into what's called the birth rate of a given population. And that will be the number of live births per 1,000 people in that population. Total fertility rate, average number of children born alive to any woman, assuming she conforms to current fertility rates. So what the total fertility rate is you take the birth rate divided by the number of women in a population, and that tells you the average number of children that a particular woman will have. Mortality is the term that is refers to incidence of death in a given population. Again, that's an unwieldy number to work with, so that number gets converted into a death rate, which is just same as the birth rate, the number of deaths per 1,000 population in a given year. So we've got birth rate, death rate as two elements of demography that allow us to examine population. We can also include in that what's called the infant mortality rate, and that's the number of deaths of infants, and that's infant is defined as between 0 and 12 months of age per 1,000 live births. So that's a little different. Infant mortality rate is actually calculated using the fertility rate as the secondary number. The primary number, of course, would be the number of infants who died, and then you would also look at the number of infants born, the fertility rate. And so it uses a different number than the birth rate and the death rate. Life expectancy, median number of years a person can be expected to live under current mortality conditions. Oftentimes when we see a country that has a lower life expectancy, if we actually dig a little deeper, we'll find out that they have a high infant mortality rate. And a high infant mortality rate will really lower the life expectancy of people. For instance, in roughly 2010, the nation of Chad had an average life expectancy of about 51 years. This doesn't mean that people are only living to 51 years of age because they have a high infant mortality rate. In general, the population, once they make it past their first year of life, can expect to live somewhere around, I believe it was 62 years, but the high infant mortality rate really drug down the life expectancy in that particular nation. A couple of others that would be demographic elements would be immigration and emigration. So if you have fertility, mortality, infant mortality, immigration, and emigration, you can crunch all those numbers and figure out the population growth rate. As you see down there, the growth rate, difference between births and deaths, plus the difference between immigrants and emigrants. At this point in time, within the United States of America, births and deaths are roughly equal. And the growth, the majority of the growth, population growth that happens in the United States of America happens because of higher rates of immigration than emigration. The demographic transition refers to changes in population demographic factors as the society goes through industrialization. In high-income developed nations that have already passed through the demographic transition, you tend to have much lower birth rates and death rates. In agrarian, pre-industrialized countries, you have much higher birth rates and death rates. That's referred to as the pre-transition state. High birth rates and death rates with little population growth. As a society begins to undergo the industrialization process, they move into the transition stage. And this is where you'll actually see a boom occur in the population size. You have declining death rates, high to medium fertility, birth rates, resulting in significant population growth. The reason this happens is that as a society undergoes industrialization, three very important things happen. One is science gets applied to the practice of medicine, so you have scientific medicine. You also have improved personal hygiene and improved public sanitation. All three of these together contribute to a decrease in both infant mortality and an increase in life expectancy. So the reason that you have significant population growth is new material conditions have created a period of cultural lag where the behaviors of people having a high number of children because of high mortality rates and high infant mortality rates has not yet caught up to the reduction in infant mortality and the improvements in life expectancy and health resulting from industrialization process. So in the transition stage, you can see a population swell. And then the post-transition stage is when we exit that period of cultural lag and adapt to the new material conditions created by the industrialization process, resulting in a change in behavior and families having fewer children. Up until the year 1800, roughly, there were less than 1 billion people in the world. It took us until about 1920 to hit 2 billion. And since 1920, we have added another 5 billion people to the population in the world. And at this point in time, I believe the doubling rate, or the rate at which population on a planetary scale doubles, is somewhere around 35 years, which means by 2050, 2049, if population growth continues unchecked, we will have 14 billion people living on this planet. There are more people alive right now than have died in all of human history. So I'm just trying to show you, when it says there have been staggering increases in the world population during the 20th century, in 100 years, between 1920 roughly and now, we added 5 billion people to the world's population. Now, a population pyramid is a bar chart that breaks down a population of a particular country, nation, society, whatever unit you're using, breaks it down into age cohorts of 10 years, and it breaks it down by sex. On one half, you'll have horizontal bars indicating men, and on the other half indicating women. And the reason that they call it a population pyramid is that in an undeveloped country, the cohorts at the bottom will be the largest and the cohorts at the top will be the smallest. As the society goes through the demographic transition, it doesn't really resemble a pyramid. What it resembles then is sort of a pregnant pyramid, in that the bottom is definitely wider than the top still, but there's a swell and the middle bars are actually the longest bars. That's where that population went through the demographic transition. And finally, when you get to an industrialized high-income nation, tends to be more of a rectangular shape, where all age cohorts tend to be roughly the same in size until you get to much higher ages, over 70. And that's when you see a little decrease in the number of people. But up through 70, there tend to be much closer age cohort sizes in a high-income industrialized nation than there are in a low-income pre-industrial nation. Population growth, of course, in a nation that has a more kind of rectangular-shaped population pyramid than one that's much more triangularly shaped and resembles one of the great pyramids in its dimensions. In the former, population growth would not be a problem. It's in the latter that population growth is a problem. I believe at the same time that the population growth rate for the planet is 35 years, it's roughly 77 years in the United States of America, and it's somewhere around 15 years for some of the nations like Bangladesh. Here in the United States and in the other industrial nations, we've gone through these two patterns of population growth in the last 4 decades, roughly. We had the high fertility and rapid growth, declining fertility and little growth. Although 4 decades, yeah, maybe a little bit more at this point in time, since the United States has had high fertility and rapid growth. because we're talking about the baby boom generation, which was roughly from 1945 to 1955. Births rose dramatically. The baby boom generation, at this point in time, the younger members would be, what would that be, 59, 69 years old? And 45 would be 79 years old, so they are kind of starting to decline in numbers at this point in time. There was also a decrease in number of childless marriages and one-child families. There was kind of a wave of like ideology that swept through, wanting to really kind of celebrate the end of the war, and a lot of returning GIs got married and had kids, and a lot of people, as the nation began to provide better jobs, industrial type jobs, marriage increased at that point in time. And then, of course, this is also when we saw the beginnings of the big suburban expansion, as high wages and general prosperity in the 10 to 20 years following the end of World War II, encouraged married couples to have children and purchase homes. As I mentioned before, the fertility rate of the U.S. remained low for 3 decades, but the nation continues to grow in size. We are not at zero population growth, but this primarily results from immigration, greater amounts of immigration than emigration, because we're close to zero population growth with respect to fertility and mortality. Population projections between 2006 and 2050 indicate 28 countries, including 20 in Europe, show a decline in population. Europe right now currently is losing about 0.1% of its population per year, owing to low fertility and higher rates of emigration than immigration. Migration is the general term, the relatively permanent movement of people with purpose of changing their place of residence. Just because you go and visit some other country does not mean you've migrated there. Migration is really with the intent of establishing a new home. There are a lot of different reasons that people can be spurred to migrate. Economic reasons, people seeking economic opportunities, racial and religious bigotry, people fleeing. A lot of Jewish people fled 1930s Europe trying to get away from Hitler. Dislike for prevailing political regimes, could be fear of one's life from prevailing political regimes, as we've seen with some of the children coming up from South America and Central America. Desire to reunite one's family, which kind of results in a pattern of what we would call chain migration, where one member of a family migrates to a new country, establishes, and then facilitates other family members joining that first family member. On an international scale, I forget the exact number, but it could be as high as 20%. Population redistribution, about 20% of the world's population is attempting to immigrate to another country. I don't believe that much of it's actually successful, but during certain periods, changes of residence can, across national boundaries, can really facilitate redistributing the world's population. Legal immigrants to the U.S. account for 50 to 60% of the nation's growth. And that's not counting the other immigrants that get here by other means. Immigration has been an issue throughout much of Europe in the last decade. Developing countries in Asia and Africa encountering difficulties as people leave to emigrate to other nations, creating what we might call brain drain, which is where people with much needed education, skills, and expertise flee to or move to high-income nations to have a higher standard of living, despite the fact that their skills, trade, education would all be of much more benefit in the nation from which they come. When we talk about within a society, the United States is often referred to as a very mobile society. People tend to, once they get married, actually establish new residence not near the parents of either the bride or the groom, or the groom or the groom or the bride or the bride, depending on how you look at it. But in the United States, the pattern is that once people get married, they tend to establish a new residence, which is referred to as neo-locality rather than patrilocality or matrilocality. If you look at my family, just me and my brothers I have 3 brothers, and we're scattered in 4 different states across most of the country. I'm here in Indiana. My brother Chris is in Kansas. My brother James is in Arizona. And my brother Drew is in California. My father's in Arizona. My mother's in Texas. I have cousins in Atlanta, cousins in Kansas, family kind of all over the country, really. But when we look at it, internal migration, it does happen in other countries as well. Generally, residents of a country are legally free to move from one locality to another. This has not always been true at various times. Under apartheid, for instance, in South Africa, for blacks to move from one location to another, they had to have a pass. It's what's referred to as the pass laws of South Africa. Essentially, black citizens of South Africa had to carry papers with them at all time, and were not free to move from where the government located them. Taking a look at cities, of course, cities have been around for a long time, but the idea of large cities is a fairly recent phenomenon. When we look at pre-industrial cities, really we're talking about a few thousand people living within the borders. A city of 50,000 people would have been massive in medieval Europe. That would have been a very, very large city. So they didn't have the massive metropolitan areas we have now, where we have like Los Angeles and New York here, and Chicago here in the United States of America, Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Berlin, London, Rome, all these massive accumulations of people living in limited geographical areas. Pre-industrial cities, few thousand people living within the borders, characterized by relatively closed class systems and not a whole lot of social mobility. Ascribed status on such characteristics as family background. Education was reserved for somewhere between 2 and 5% of the population on average. I mean, even here in the United States of America in 1910, somewhere between 4 and 6% of the population graduated and achieved a college degree. Early cities remained small. A lot of that had to do with transportation of goods, production methods, because they relied on animal power and had modest levels of surplus. They couldn't store and transport food, kind of the way that we take for granted in our modern industrialized, or actually we're post-industrialized society here in the United States. Getting to the city wasn't a matter of jumping in your car and driving to the city. from a farm to a city meant a substantial trek, usually. City life could be very dangerous. It still can be very dangerous if you don't know which neighborhoods to go into. Industrial city, of course, more populous and complex than predecessors. As industrialization sweeps through a society, you see a reduction in the rural population and an increase in the urban population. Jobs are moving off of the farms and into the factories. And so they become more populous and complex than predecessors. And then a post-industrial city where information, you have global finance and electronic flow of information dominating the economy. And if you think about the high-paying, benefited jobs in our society, they are all within those two areas. Urbanism, concept developed by Lewis Worth to explain attitudes and behaviors developed by people living in large urban areas that are distinctive from rural patterns of behavior. Lewis Worth kind of took a look at that. Others that had their ideas on the difference between agrarian social cohesion and urban social cohesion, industrialized social cohesion. You look at Durkheim, Tönnies. Durkheim has mechanical and organic solidarity. Tönnies is Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. So urbanism has become a central aspect of life in the U.S. It tends to be, like Tönnies would say, Gesellschaft organization, which is more anonymous. As Durkheim would say, characterized by organic solidarity, which is a solidarity based on complementary differences and mutual interdependence rather than something, like being similar to your neighbors. 1950, only New York and Tokyo had populations over 10 million. By 2025, there will be more than 30 cities with populations over 10 million. I believe Mexico City is still the largest city with 28 million people living there. So, how do we look at urban lifestyle? Well, beginning with the idea of human ecology, which is the interrelationships between people and their spatial settings and physical environments, one of the functionalist perspectives is what's called urban ecology. And this is the interrelationships between people and an urban environment. So it's looking at interrelationships between people and their spatial settings in an urban area. It's functionalist in orientation. When we talk about Robert Park and Ernest Burgess's concentric zone theory of a city, if we look at cities that developed in the pre-industrial era, we will see this more kind of pattern of growth of a city that was established prior to widespread industrialization. And it's essentially looks at a city as having a nucleus and then expanding out in concentric rings. And the center of the nucleus, the downtown area, is the most highly valued land, and then each succeeding zone surrounding the center contains other types of land which are valued differently. You may have residential areas, you may have business areas, but they'll develop in kind of rings outside of that nucleus. Creation of zones is a social process, but concentric zone theory kind of fails to address issues of gender, race, and class. And remember, when they were developing this theory, they were working at the University of Chicago. And if you look at kind of the way that Chicago is laid out, you've got the downtown loop area, which is highly valued, and then not exactly rings, but half rings develop out from that to a certain extent. Multiple nuclei theory is a little different. All urban growth does not radiate out from a central district. You find this in kind of cities that developed later. And what you'll find is instead of having like a specific downtown area where all the high value land is, you'll have different areas: manufacturing district, business district, banking district, shopping district, and they will all be in different regions within an urban environment. It's the idea that a metropolitan area can have many centers of development. Rise of suburban shopping mass, example of multiple nuclei within metropolitan areas. Sometimes as well, this happens when you have two cities that are close together, and then stuff begins to develop within the middle areas. This can also lead to what are called edge cities, communities on the outskirts of major metropolitan areas that become economic and social centers with identities. Right now, everybody's familiar with Dallas and Fort Worth, but more and more people will begin hearing about Arlington. Arlington exists kind of in that center area between Dallas and Fort Worth on the south side. Arlington is now rapidly growing and has some economic development there because it's the home of baseball, hockey, and now football with the new ballpark at Arlington, or the new stadium, Cowboys Stadium in Arlington. So Arlington is kind of developing its own identity outside of being part of the DFW area. There are a number of cities within DFW that aren't necessarily independent. Okay, and then moving away from kind of the functionalist view into a conflict view, we get this idea of the new urban sociology, which looks at the interplay of local, national, and worldwide forces and their effects on local space. We can bring in elements of Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems analysis looking at this. Certain industrialized nations hold dominant positions at the core of the global economic system. The world systems analysis appears similar to the idea of the concentric zone theory, but the concentric zone theory is looking at one city. World systems analysis groups the nations of the world into a core, semi-periphery, and periphery. And in the core, you have the high-income industrialized nations of the world, the nations that continue to extract resources and labor from the periphery nations, the low-income pre-industrial nations, and then in the semi-periphery are those nations that are kind of going through the industrialization process and the demographic transition process themselves. So we look at rapidly growing cities in developing countries, product of colonialism and global economy controlled by core nations and multinational corporations. The areas in low-income nations where there is growth are in the cities left over from colonial periods oftentimes. So, urban dwellers. We talked about Lewis Wirth and his attitude, his ideas of urbanism, which are attitudes developed and behaviors developed by people living in dense urban environments. Cities in the U.S. are destinations for immigrants from all around the world. If you think about like New York City, it's got a lot of Italian, Jewish, Chinese, and other Puerto Rican, other minority groups as well. Herbert Gans was another sociologist working in the first half of the 20th century, came up with this idea of 5 types of urban dwellers. The cosmopolites, these are the people that like to go down to the arts districts and things like that. Unmarried and childless people living in a downtown environment. If you don't have children, living in a loft kind of thing. Ethnic villagers, these would be kind of like ethnic enclaves. from immigration, the deprived and the trapped, which tend to be the same group, the poor. And a lot of time ethnic villagers can turn into the deprived and the trapped. So, taking a look at cities, what are some of the issues facing cities? Crime, pollution, schools, inadequate transportation. So, when it says central cities, it's talking about like large urban environments, say the Kansas City, the Denver, the Cleveland, the Indianapolis, Chicago, Philadelphia, Dallas, San Antonio. And oftentimes these are issues facing these larger central cities. A lot of crime in urban environments. Pollution, of course. Think about Los Angeles, the smog problem they have there. Public schools and the issues facing public schools. Because oftentimes there's not enough funding for public schools, because a lot of where you see the funding gap is not so much what gets assigned to schools by the federal government or from state governments, but that's what the local property taxes that fund education locally vary greatly between urban and suburban environments. Inadequate transportation. Sometimes it's hard to get around in some of the cities. I mean, in Los Angeles, if you don't have a car, there are subways there, but it's hard to get outside the LA basin. And hard to get to some regions using that. Suburbs are residential communities that develop near large cities. 3 social factors differentiating suburbs from cities. They're much less dense because people tend to own homes with yards out there. So, even people, the cosmopolites and the urban dwellers who live in cities tend to live in apartments and lofts and multiple dwelling units. Private space. A lot of people, the yard becomes a private space, especially if you put a fence up around it. And then what more exacting building codes, and what that refers to is like restrictions on the types of things that can be built in residential neighborhoods and suburban areas. In the suburbs, if we talk about internal migration in the 20th century, the fleeing from urban environments into suburban environments is the most dramatic population trend in the U.S. throughout the 20th century. A large percentage of our population lives what you would call a suburban lifestyle. And when you think about it, like living in Valparaiso, Valparaiso has a downtown area. But really, anywhere you live in Valparaiso, you're kind of living a sort of suburban lifestyle. Because even in the downtown area, there are a lot of private homes with private yards. A phenomenon referred to as white flight is the trend where successful white people who make money in urban environments have fled living in urban environments for suburban environments. So mostly the white middle class is what's moved from urban environments to suburban environments. Suburban diversity. In the U.S., race and ethnicity remain important factors to distinguish cities from suburbs. You do not have the same level of diversity in a suburb as you do in an urban environment. And what you tend to find, there has been an increase over the last 30 years of diversification of suburbs in terms of race and ethnicity as successful minorities have migrated out there. But you still tend to find minorities overwhelmingly concentrated in urban environments in the United States of America. And then we have rural communities, 17% of the U.S. population living in rural areas, down from roughly 50% in 1930. U.S. farms produce 38% of the world's soybeans. Rural areas are becoming ethnically and racially diverse and have been for some time. Some of the challenges: rural areas facing problems is first associated with central cities: overdevelopment, gang warfare, drug trafficking, poverty. Um, in with reference to like drug trafficking, it's widely known that in a lot of the farming areas where farms are not successful, they have turned to production of crystal meth. And in rural communities throughout the United States, throughout the Midwest and the Great Plains, crystal meth is a huge problem. And of course, once you have drug trafficking, that's when you see problems associated with gangs, because gangs tend to fund themselves through drug trafficking. And the poverty, of course, farming is just not very lucrative. Post-industrial revolution has been unkind to rural areas. Depopulation, economic stagnations, construction of large businesses hurt local merchants. So, you know, the large shopping enterprises make it hard for all the rural main streets and farming communities, the businesses along there, to remain successful. Okay, finally, taking a look at the homeless issue. In the U.S., there was a huge problem with this. It kind of began in 2000, at the end of 2008, with the beginning of the Great Recession. The economic downturn created a lot of people who had to vacate their homes when their homes were foreclosed, and a lot of them have become homeless. But for people on a global scale, housing problem means finding shelter of any kind that they can afford in a place where anyone would reasonably wish to live. I mean, shanty towns oftentimes have essentially frames made out of packing crates with walls and roof made out of cardboard, corrugated cardboard. You know, nobody in the United States of America could legally live in something like that because of building codes that exist. Homelessness occurs in industrialized and developing countries. Close to 750,000 people in the United States of America are homeless on any given night. Third world countries, a lot of times what happens is rapid population growth simply grows beyond the ability, the existing resources for housing. So, thinking of some of the concepts we've been discussing, if we go back to the ideas we had on status and role and master status, being homeless functions as a master status. It's the way that a person is seen, regardless of anything else about them. And because they're homeless, and so much of, a much higher percentage of people in the U.S. are homeowners than in a lot of other countries. Something like 67% of the people in the U.S. are homeowners. And home ownership is something that people work towards in the U.S. more so than in other countries. People without some type of home at all are very stigmatized and live almost outside U.S. society. Especially with the recent recession, we've seen a lot more people displaced who are younger. And the homeless population is growing faster than increase in emergency food and shelter. I serve on the board of directors of Housing Opportunities, which is a homelessness advocacy group. Our goal at Housing Opportunities is to transition people in Porter County, Indiana, from being homeless to permanent affordable housing. We have a number of facilities that are low-income affordable housing in Porter County and in LaPorte County as well. We operate there too. And we have waiting lists all the time for people to get in there. Homelessness is a problem. It might not seem like it's a problem in Porter County, but homelessness is a problem even in Porter County. And what also displaces low-income people is the process of what's called gentrification, which is the reclamation of urban environments that have become dilapidated, and building new living places and shopping places there. And gentrification tends to displace lower income people because once the new housing is built, it's usually not affordable to the people that were living there. So, when you say homeless shelter, large, overcrowded, unhealthy shelters. Homeless people tend to have higher incidences of influenza and other transmissible diseases, and so the reason that they're unhealthy is because they're in large communal areas. And in the United States of America, in the last 20 years, a lot of anti-vagrancy laws have been passed. And those are the laws targeting and stigmatizing homeless people and criminalizing the status of being homeless. Vagrancy or loitering laws in general are put in place to prohibit homeless people from congregating in certain areas. Only 41% of our population believes that hunger and homelessness are problems that need to be dealt with. So it's part of the national consciousness, but it's not really an overriding concern here in the United States of America. Okay, that concludes the lecture covering Chapter 20. I'm going to take a slight break, and then I will begin the lecture covering Chapters 21 and 22 in just a few minutes. This is Matthew Howell. I am at the Valparaiso campus of Ivy Tech, mhowell1 at ivytech.edu if you would like to contact me. And I am also happy to report that I will be continuing these sessions in the spring semester.